Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. A special welcome to our friends, the friends of the Capodimonte, some of whom have come from Italy, but a warm welcome to everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the Director and CEO of the Fine Art Museums, and it's a pleasure to be with you to do this inaugural lecture for the exhibition of the Battle of Pavia Tapestries and Arms and Armour from the Museo e Real Bosco di Capodimonte in Naples. As we'll be discussing in a minute, the tapestries depict one of the most consequential events of the 16th century European history. And they also represent a turning point in the history of the tapestry medium. And as some of you know, I was a tapestry scholar before I became a director. I used to be known as Tapestry Tom. So it's an especial pleasure to be talking about these tapestries. At the De Young, the exquisite presentation of the tapestries has been enhanced by the preparatory drawings generously lent from the Louvre, which I think is the first time the drawings and tapestries have been shown together. So I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Louvre for their collaboration. It takes a village to bring an exhibition like this together, and I want to thank David Gramazio from Museum Box, who has been the coordinator of this project, as well as our partners at the Campbell and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. It was at the Campbell, it's going to the Museum of Fine Arts. I want to thank Jeffrey Freeman, the host curator here at the Fine Art Museums, and for the extraordinary team of designers and installers and everybody else who's been involved in making as you'll see, a really beautiful exhibition. Most of all, I want to extend my profound gratitude to the Museo Capodimonte for their generosity and their partnership in bringing these tapestries to America, more or less 500 years after the event that they record. It was a real pleasure to work with the museum's former director, Sylvain Bellinger, on this ambitious endeavour in the project's early stages, and we have been equally pleased to welcome and work with Dr. Eike Schmidt as our partner on the completion of this exhibition. Eike, as many of you know, was previously the director of the Uffizi in Florence, and was key to some very generous loans last year for the Botticelli drawings exhibition that many of you undoubtedly saw. So with that, I'm going to kick into gear and let's talk about tapestries. Can I have the first, maybe I do it myself. The first slide, here we go. So as I just mentioned, the Battle of Pavia Tapestries occupy a really special place in the history of European tapestry. They depict a very important historic event in Italy in February 1525, a turning point in the geopolitics of Europe at the time. They also are groundbreaking because it was the first set of tapestries in which an artist, a team of artists, set out to represent a recent historical event at such scale and with such realism and verisimilitude. And it was absolutely groundbreaking, as we'll see. Had this series, this immersive sequence of images being created in fresco, it would probably be one of the most famous works of art of the Renaissance. But perhaps because it's in tapestry, it's largely been overlooked. Tapestry is a medium that as a whole has been neglected for all sorts of reasons by the modern art history establishment, which largely focuses on painting and sculpture. So we're going to dive in today and try and get back to why these tapestries were so groundbreaking. And perhaps we'll start off with some of you, I suspect, are familiar, but some of you may be less familiar with the medium. So let's start at the beginning. What is a tapestry? The term is widely used today to describe any sort of textured fabric, often confused with needlepoint. And of course, there are lots of machine-made textiles around that are often termed tapestry. But in the sense I'm using the term today, we're talking about a specific form of handmade textile. Tapestries, essentially, it's a very simple in principle. Tapestries are a fabric in which the medium is inseparable from the design. You have plain threads running in one direction, and weavers pass coloured threads in and out, back and forth, to cover up the plain threads to create a pattern. And you see a model here that just gives you, the basic idea. The weft threads, the coloured threads, are tamped down, so the plain threads, the warp threads, are totally covered up. Because it's such a simple art form, we know it was practiced in ancient times. There are literary descriptions of tapestry production in the ancient Greek world, in the Roman world, and tiny fragments survive from the early Middle Ages, but very little, because textiles, of course, are so vulnerable to the passage of time. Textiles, rich textiles, were an essential part of the splendor of courts throughout the ages. And from the early Middle Ages, we find lots of references to textiles and tapetum. It's hard to distinguish what are really tapestries, what are just rich textiles. But everything begins to come into clearer focus in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, when it's clear that there were sizable productions of tapestry going on in towns, North European towns like Paris and Arras. Many of the medieval tapestries were woven on upright looms, high warp looms, in which the warp threads run vertically. This is a loom I saw at the Vatican a couple of years ago. We're looking at the back of it. You can see how the coloured threads are wound on bobbins that the weavers will pass back and forth. Let's zoom in. There you go. So you see the weaver will work across, area of crimson, and then if it goes into purple or green, he'll put that bobbin down and start working with the green, looping the threads together at the interface of the colours so that you don't get a slit. From the late Middle Ages, a variation of this loom becomes more common, the low warp loom, in which the warp threads are arranged horizontally to the ground. The advantage of this technique is that the warp threads can be attached to drawstrings, which are attached to foot pedals. So by moving the foot pedals, the weaver creates what's called a shed. He separates alternate, even and odd threads and has both hands free to pass the colours back and forth. So it's a faster process of production. The other absolutely critical thing about this is that the cartoon, the full-scale design that the weavers copy, can be cut into strips and placed directly beneath the warp threads. So to see where they are, the weaver just has to look through the warp threads. And with a complex design, this is really helpful. Speeds up production and allows the reproduction of very detailed designs. Here's a detail. I think you can just make out that the cartoon, you can see here these horizontal lines of the cartoon that have been already completed in this section of the tapestry. Here's one of the combs the weavers use to tamp down the weft thread. It's a simple principle, But to reproduce complex figurative designs took huge skill. And during the late Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, sizable industries develop in the northern towns, supported by the guild systems, where weavers are apprenticed in the age of 12, 13, predominantly men, and train for a period of 4, 5, 6 years before some of them have the opportunity to become master weavers. And during this period, huge sums pour into towns like Paris, like Arras, like Tournai in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, because tapestry is what all the nobles want. They're moving from one castle to another. Tapestry was a movable feast. It was practical. You could chuck your tapestries on the back of a cart, send them ahead of the court, and in the time it took to hang them up, the tapestries could transform a dark, dank interior into a richly coloured, very impressive space. Now, of course, tapestries kept out the drafts, so they were practical. But it was much more than that. Tapestries were figurative splendor. In an age when any image was very rare, tapestries were huge images. And they provided the rulers of the day with a canvas on which they could depict their heroes from history and mythology. They could depict themselves if they wanted to spend a lot of money. In more private rooms, they could have, decorative, romantic scenes of lovers in gardens and allegories of love. So tapestries were all surrounding in the castles of the time. Many of you will know this image dating from the early 15th century, the Duke of Berry's Très Riche Heure, with an illumination of a nobleman at his feast at a banquet, but in front of a great fire. There's a screen behind him looking like a halo, protecting his back from the heat. And up behind him is this enormous tapestry, hung up by hooks, depicting some sort of violent battle. We don't know if it was a historical or mythological. And the subject matter was very diverse. Typically, the tapestries of the day were visually very complex. Hang on, I've lost one. There we go. Oh, no, we've lost a slide. Oh, no. Oh, sorry, this is the court of Charles VII in France in the mid-15th century. Again, you see huge armorial tapestries all around, a very magnificent display of power. Typically, tapestries of this period were visually dense. This is pretty much life-size. It's about 1/3 of a much wider panel, one of 9, depicting the story of Troy. And it's almost like a brain burn. It's kind of like a kaleidoscope. Your eye, you have to kind of really study the surface to understand what's going on. And then you'll see that some of the figures have got inscriptions. This is Diomedes, this is Hector, this is Paris. These tapestries were hung in huge empty spaces where many of the courtiers of the day had to wait long periods of time for the reception to see the nobleman, the king they wanted to see. Tapestries gave people something to look at. So this visual density was, it lent itself to that sort of space. And you can imagine there would have been court specialists standing around explaining, well, of course, the reason this is relevant to Henry VII or Charles VIII is because he, just like Hercules, did this, or he, just like Trajan, did that. The other reason for this visual density is that where a painter can blend colour on the surface is working on, the canvas or the wood panel, working from a light color into a dark color, into a light color, or from dark to light to dark, to suggest shadow, highlight, shadow. The weaver can't do that. He's working with pure thread, so to suggest volume, the weaver has to create lots of little triangles of color. A dark color going into a medium color going into a lighter color. It's very time-consuming. So it was much more practical to have more two-dimensional designs. And even as we get up into around 1500, the early 16th century, this practical aspect of tapestry production led to a rather conservative style of design. Here, for example, this is a tapestry of glorification of Christ and the Virgin Mary, dating from about 1500, made for Philip and Joanna the Mad, the kings of Spain, around 1500. And the orangey area is all actually gold thread. But you can see how this is really looking back to mid-15th century paintings by Rogier van der Weyden and others. The emphasis is two-dimensional on the decorative clothes, on the decorative elements, the architectural elements. Yes, the faces are very minutely rendered, almost like a painting. But overall, it's highly patterned. And this style of design is known as pre-Renaissance style of tapestry design. The leading center of production from around 1500 becomes Brussels, which is the heart of the northern kingdoms of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian, who dies in 1519. And his grandson, Charles V, who by this time is already the King of Spain, becomes the heir at the age of, I think it's 19, to the largest empire in the world, encompassing much of Northern Europe and Spain and the ambitions across the Atlantic in the New World. Charles can't run all of it himself, so he delegates the rule of the Low Countries, the Netherlands, is delegated to his aunt, Margaret of Austria, who is herself a keen tapestry patron. And she's really the dominant personality in Brussels, the lead artistic patron in Brussels. And in 1518, she appoints Bernard van Orley as her court artist. Van Orley is son of an artist, brother of another artist, highly skilled, but also deeply imbued in a somewhat retardataire, rather old-fashioned style of painting. Sweet, simpering Madonnas, looking back to the 15th century. This panel in the Prado is typical. But he's highly talented, very well connected, and he is to become the driving force in what will become a seismic change in tapestry production. His early works, we know, are somewhat conventional. This is one of a set of 4 tapestries he designed for a church in Brussels that depicts the story of a miraculous statue. And here in this scene, we see the miraculous statue of the Virgin being carried to the church. You see how this is still quite old-fashioned. The scenes, there's some sense of depth, but the scenes are set in these elaborate architectural frames. There's still a lot of emphasis on the patterns of the textiles. Here, he interpolates the portrait of the young King Charles as one of the figures carrying this miraculous sculpture. Happened quite a lot at this time. The catalyst that was to really drive change in Brussels tapestry design was the commission that Pope Leo X, down in Rome, gave to his artist, Raphael, for a set of tapestries to hang in the Sistine Chapel. The commission was probably given in about 1514, and the tapestries were designed 1514 to 1515. Weaving was underway by about 1516 in Brussels, the leading center of the time. Raphael, the Vatican was full of tapestries. Raphael saw the tapestry medium as a medium that he could do something totally new in. He painted designs that really were like the frescoes he was then painting in the Vatican apartments. And that he made no concessions to the decorative style of the past. Instead, his cartoons, which depicted the acts of the apostles, St. Peter and St. Paul, portrayed large, muscular figures in perspectival, empty spaces. It's quite remarkable that the weavers in Brussels managed to interpret them as well as they did. The tapestries survive today in Rome at the Vatican. Pretty faded, pretty damaged. But you see, this is the conversion of St. Paul, the centurion, who falls from his horse when God calls out to him, why, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So this is the scene that Raphael designed, woven in tapestry in Brussels. And you see this dramatic, muscular figure, horses rearing, the drama of the moment. This is unlike anything that had been done in tapestry before. Here's the detail. Well, this was hard for the Brussels weavers, and we don't see an immediate change. On the contrary, at this time, here's the tapestries hung at the Vatican in 2020, the 500th anniversary of their delivery to the Vatican. So you see how splendid they are. Incidentally, they cost 5 times more than the Michelangelo ceiling above. Just a reminder of how expensive tapestry like this was. This is a bit smaller than life size. This is one of 9 tapestries that Van Orley was designing at the time that the Acts of the Apostles were delivered, will be made in Brussels. It still looks back to that medieval style. It's a set of allegories that celebrate the virtues of the Habsburg rulers. And here we see Samuel anointing David as a kind of a mirror image of the ancient rituals that surrounded the anointing of the Habsburg rulers. There are hundreds of figures in this. They're all named, they all have a meaning, but it's very, very dense. Quite frankly, Van Orley was probably so busy working on this, he didn't have time to think about anything else. But here's a detail. This is a portrait of Margaret of Austria, down here. In the coming years, though, we begin to see him experimenting. Here, for example, is a design for a set of Romulus and Remus. And you can see how he's trying to create a much deeper architectural space. He's got a much more classical, still pretty fanciful, but classical architecture, figures with much greater presence and muscularity, beginning to absorb the Raphaelesque influence. Here is one of a set of 4 exquisite Passion tapestries made around 1525, 1526, that ended up in the collection of Henry VIII, the King of England. And here we see a combination. Partly it's the sense of space from Raphael, but he's also looking at engravings by Dürer, who he met in Brussels, the kind of wizened faces and the curly beards. So he's kind of combining different elements. So this is where Van Orley was in the mid-1520s. And now let's take a step back. Let's go back to the history. In 1524, the French king, Francis I, had led a French army into northern Italy. He saw it as his destiny to conquer northern Italy, much as his predecessor Louis XII had attempted to do. And they were making great progress. They had taken Milan, and they were laying siege to Pavia, about 20 miles south of Milan, which was the gateway to heading on into Italy. But they were held up by a valiant siege by the defenders of the town of Pavia. And so they laid siege to it over the winter. And it's to try and relieve this siege that the imperial army comes in early 1525. The army is made up of a mix of Burgundian troops, Swiss and German mercenaries, much as the French army was a patchwork. It was armies of this time were put together, and there was a lot of money changed hands. On the morning of February the 24th, 1525, the imperial troops broke through the wall of a park, a hunting park just outside Pavia, called Mirabello Park, which is where the large part of the French army was encamped. And they crept through the woods, and they surprised the French army at dawn. And the French counterattacked, big cavalry charge, and the secret weapon, the decisive factor in this battle, were the handguns, the arquebusiers, essentially muskets that the imperial troops had, of which the bullets could pierce armor. And so there were all these fabulous French cavalrymen, the cream of French nobility, galloping about in their armor, to be wiped out by the modern artillery of the Habsburg soldiers. The battle was over in 3 or 4 hours. The French king was captured, and was eventually taken to Spain for a year. It changed the course of history in Europe at that time. The victory was celebrated in, just a couple of details of that Van Orley Passion series. The victory was celebrated in songs, in poems, in speeches, in declarations, in engravings, and in paintings. Very quickly. It was a seismic moment in the balance of European power. This is one of the contemporary engravings, somewhat stylized, but you see the town of Pavia with its towers in the distance. You see the melee of the battle in the foreground. Here's another contemporary painting of another aspect of the battle, typically with these very high bird's eye views. We don't know exactly how or when the Tapestry series was conceived. We know that it was delivered, it was presented to Charles V in March 1531, when he came back to Brussels for the first time in 9 years, having been in Spain and then going through his Germanic territories. He comes back to Brussels in March 1531 and is presented with these 7 tapestries depicting this great victory, this defining victory. Now, how did those tapestries get to that moment at the Coudenberg Palace where they're being hung up? We don't know. But we do know that each of these tapestries, given its size and quality of weaving, very finely woven, high numbers of warps, high numbers of wefts, all the gold thread, an incredibly expensive commission with incredible detail that must have involved a great many people at the court advising the whole process. The weaving of each tapestry must have taken about 2 years, and the preparation of the cartoons probably at least a year. When we think that it was unusual to weave an entire set at the same time, it was much more common to weave them, in 2 tranches or 3 tranches. So the likelihood is, in fact, that these tapestries, 1531, 1529, 1529, 1527, 4 years plus 1 for the weaving, the designs must have been commissioned pretty soon after the battle itself. And while we know that medieval battles were portrayed in tapestry in that older, highly decorative style, nothing had ever been done like this. Because Van Orley, based on clearly the input he got from the court advisors he was working with, distilled the events of the battle. Do you want to get that? Distilled the events of the battle down into, please. Distilled the events of the battle down into 7 monumental scenes, each one with multiple components. And we don't know about the preliminary phases, but what we do know is that the Louvre now has 7 drawings, grisaille drawings, in which the composition has largely been established. Van Orley positions the scenes just above, it's not high up, but it is a bird's eye view, so that you see figures in the foreground, a principal scene, and then secondary and tertiary scenes in the background. So here, for example, is the drawing for what I think is the first tapestry in the series. In the background, we see the Habsburg troops emerging through the trees at dawn. Here we have the French king leading the counterattack, and the musketeers in the tapestries, it's even clearer. They're already firing their guns. We have here the French cavalry beginning to retreat with the French king right in the center. Here, the second or third scene, we have the baggage train of the Habsburg army breaking through the wall and following the soldiers onto the field, where they're going to strip the dead bodies and pillage everything they can find. No one had ever conceived a tapestry, or a painting for that matter, in North Europe like this before. And I think the probable source, kind of influence here, was again what was going on in Rome. At this time, now Raphael was dead, died in 1520, but his pupils, Giulio Romano, Gianfrancesco Peni, and others, were still hard at work painting frescoes for the Pope. And in particular, Giulio Romano and Peni were working in the Sala di Costantino, which has an enormous fresco of the victory of Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. You see here Constantine in the center, figures, violence of the battle, foreground, distance. And I think that we know that artists from Raphael's workshop were going from Rome to Brussels, taking cartoons with them. And I think that one of them in particular, a man called Tommaso Vincitor, must have taken some drawings of the Sala di Costantino and other Raphael workshop projects, and also including a putative set of tapestries of the triumphs, of the victories of Scipio. And I think that must have been the factor, the tipping factor that inspired Van Orley in the conception, the layout of the tapestries. Here is the kind of, in a way, the crux of the whole series, where the French king, Francis I, his horse is brought down by a gunshot, and here he is being helped from his horse by members of the Habsburg army. Here is the head of the chief general of the Habsburg army dismounting to take the surrender of the French king. So these drawings, and here we have another fantastic drawing. This is the penultimate scene in the tapestries, with this very detailed view of Pavia behind. Now, we have no evidence, there's no reason to think that Van Orley was on this campaign, but the detail of the cityscape is such that I wonder whether an artist was sent down to Pavia to record it, so that it could be properly represented in the tapestries. Again, there's a level of detail here that is unprecedented in tapestry design before. The drawings were the basis of full-scale cartoons that the weavers were going to copy, one-to-one. The cartoons were painted in watercolor on paper and cut in strips, as I showed earlier, for the weaving process. Generally, the weaving process was pretty damaging to cartoons, because very often, as the weavers completed a section of tapestry, that would be wound onto the roller, and very often the cartoons would get caught up and wound in as well, so they'd get crackled and paint would flake off. So in fact, the cartoons for this series do not survive, except for this sweet little dog's head, which you'll see in one of the tapestries where the French baggage train that is fleeing from the French camp. And there's a woman in the foreground carrying this little dog as she escapes. And it's in reverse direction, because the weaving process reverses the design. Yes, this is the one fragment surviving. The tapestries were made in the workshop of some merchants called de Moyen. The industry was dominated by, it's a bit like the film studios of Hollywood today. Because of the cost of materials and the advanced costs of the weavers, the industry was dominated by these kind of mega merchants, many of whom were also dealing in bullion, lending money to the emperor, trading wine, and so on. So these tapestries were made in the workshop of a family called de Moyen. This is their mark. You'll see it in the bottom right corner of a couple of the tapestries upstairs. And then here we are getting to the tapestries themselves, this is about one-to-one. This is the size of the tapestries you'll see upstairs. What to me, I've already touched on a number of reasons why these are so remarkable. I've known them many years now. I've visited them in Naples several times. But what never ceases to amaze me is the technical skill with which the weavers met this challenge. These large, highly volumetric figures, the amount of minute weaving, the hatchings required to suggest volume, that they managed with such ability to translate these designs into wool and silk, silver and gold thread. And although the tapestries have perhaps lost about 25 to 30% of their original intensity, proportional to other tapestries of the time. They're still in remarkable condition. You still can read them completely, and they have the full spectrum of their colors, even if the silks especially are somewhat faded. Here we see the scene I just described with the baggage train of the Habsburgs breaking through. You can see some of the plunder they've already picked up, sort of chickens slung over this chap's head, over his back. Here we see some of the Swiss mercenaries who are fighting for the French, who have thrown down their weapons, and there's just this one brave soul who's refusing to surrender, who's about to have his head swiped off by this imperial cavalryman. There we go. And all these figures, many of these figures are identified by little inscriptions in the tapestries. There was a great deal of literature produced about the battle at the time, with competing versions of who was more heroic. This scene, which you have to really be standing in front of to read, it's the violence of the battle. One of the problems for the French was that because their cavalry went charging off, they were actually in front of their own guns. So the French guns could not shoot at the imperial troops. So over here we have the fog of war, all the imperial musketeers wreaking havoc on the French cavalry. And here the French guns, useless. This is one of the imperial generals leading his troops, who are essentially butchering the French artillery and forces defending it. So it's very, very graphic. Here, the scene of the capture of Francis I. He was, for all that he was captured, he was honored for being a military king. There he was at the front of his troops. He was brave. He was not running away. Others did. There we go. And you see here very vividly the blood pouring from his horse's side. A man up here holding the horse's tail, trying to stop the horse falling over on the king. Of course, when you're in your heavy armor, if you're on the ground, you can't move. It's so heavy. Some of these, they had to be hoisted onto their horses. The armor was sometimes so heavy. Here we see the imperial troops about to ransack or burst through the French encampment. The drawbridge is down. The troops are beginning to run over. There's chaos and pandemonium in the French camp. Here's perhaps the royal tent with a fleur-de-lis on it. Here we have the women and the servants from the French camp fleeing away as fast as they can. Here's the lady with the little dog. You just see it there. And here are these noble ladies on this beautifully dressed on this white mule. She has her parrot on the back of her jewelry box, but it's all pandemonium. Here, there's the scene with the town in the background, the French soldiers escaping from the dugouts into which they've been hunkered down over the cold winter months and fleeing across the Ticino River, where in fact many of them were to drown. And we have some quite graphic images of people desperately trying to escape. And here's the final scene. More carnage, desperation. Desperation. The French troops are trying to break up the pontoon bridge so they can't be pursued. And over here is the Duke of Alençon, who decided to take the French guard, what remained of the French army away, rather than standing and fighting. And for this, he was accused of being a total coward back in France. So there are a number of narratives going on here, but one, of course, is the nobility, the bravery, the cowardice, and the fear. So these are all upstairs for you to enjoy. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that even as these tapestries were being completed, a sister series was being woven that also survives, that depicted the Habsburgs. If the Battle of Pavia depicts the Habsburgs as victorious in war, the series is known as the Hunts of Maximilian, but it should actually really be titled The Hunts of Charles V, because it depicts members of Charles and members of his family hunting in the hunting parks around Brussels. And like the Pavia Tapestries, the figures are life-size, the landscapes are extraordinarily realistic. And this set survives at the Louvre, terribly lit, but it's still magnificent. Here's Charles's brother, Ferdinand, in a boar hunt. Here are the hunting dogs. I don't know for some reason the slide has come out very strangely. This is actually beautiful weaving, but it doesn't look like it here. So I shall go on. There's a detail of the boar. So the tapestries were very naked propaganda. They celebrated a Habsburg victory, much as the Hunts of Maximilian celebrated Habsburg prowess. I'm sometimes asked, why? Okay, Charles V commissioned these great tapestries. Why didn't his rivals do the same thing? They surrounded themselves with tapestries too, of course, very, very expensive ones, but not propagandistic ones. I think the answer is really simple. Brussels was under the thumb of the Habsburg ruler, who, as the Reformation gained pace in Europe, was very Catholic, very conservative. Already by 1527, many of the leading Brussels tapestry weavers and designers, including Bernard van Orley, had been prosecuted for listening to sermons by left-wing priests. And they'd been fined. Actually, Van Orley lost his official title as court painter to Margaret of Austria, even though he was allowed to go on working on these designs. But it was clear that persecution was right there. So it would have been unthinkable for any tapestry designer, any tapestry maker, to make tapestries that were overtly celebratory of Charles's rivals. They got around it in other ways. Francis, once he got back to France, gave up on his territorial ambitions and instead did his best to woo Italian artists to the French court, including Leonardo da Vinci and many others. And if anyone who's been to Fontainebleau will know the famous the plaster and painted corridor. There is a tapestry series that exactly mimics, in perfect trompe-l'oeil, that corridor that was actually made at Fontainebleau, woven at Fontainebleau. Henry VIII, across the Channel, could not buy overtly propagandistic tapestries as he pursued the English Reformation, the break with Rome, the divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But what he did was commission through merchants in Antwerp, all at arm's length, deniable. He commissioned enormous expensive tapestries depicting Old Testament prophets and the apostles to reinforce the idea that he, as head of the English church, he was a prophet to his own people. He was a patriarch to his own people. So one way or another, tapestry was an essential component of the magnificence, the splendor, the propaganda of these Renaissance courts. Very little survives today. These are the Abraham tapestries at Hampton Court in England. There are about 20 tapestries that survive from Henry VIII's collection of 2,000. You know, what we see today is a fragment. Very often it's terribly damaged. So the opportunity to have the Capodimonte Battle of Pavia Tapestries here in San Francisco is, I think, a really rare treat. I hope you'll enjoy looking at the tapestries yourselves. I hope you'll encourage your friends and colleagues to come and visit them too while they're here. It's just through until January the 12th next year. We will be having a symposium. We'll be bringing in a whole lot of tapestry scholars on the 10th and 11th of January next year. And we have various educational materials and films about the tapestries, both in the galleries but also online. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take some questions. I'm happy, if anyone needs to go, please go, but I'm also happy to take questions.
Hi. Can you explain a little more about why so few managed to survive? Was it because the materials just decay faster than a painting would? Did people not know how to take care of them? Was it wars and battles and them getting in the way?
Probably all of the above. Tapestries were among the most expensive items in these great households, and they all had dedicated departments called wardrobes or garderoba, with, in some cases, 20 or 30 people dedicated to looking after these precious textiles. And we know from historical accounts that the great tapestries, the most precious cloths of state, would be hung for special occasions, and then they would be put away afterwards to preserve them. Really well into the 17th and 18th centuries. But with the various revolutions across Europe, in many cases, the tapestries end up being sold at auction. They fall into the hands of people who've not had to pay for them. They end up being treated more and more like wallpaper. And between about 1790, the French Revolution, and the 1870s, 1880s, we have a century of terrible devastation. A lot of tapestries with gold thread are burned to extract the gold thread. And in other cases, they're hung like wallpaper, and they just fade and they fall apart. And moths and damp take their damage.
Hello, I had a question actually from early on and something you just raised here. I think it was the Raphael tapestry that you showed, and along the bottom there was a whole scene like done in gold of horses and so forth, and I wondered if that represented the same image that was happening or an allegory to it. And then also, as well as wallpaper, were they ever just kind of thrown on the floor like carpets and walked all over and damaged that way as well?
Sure. So one of the innovative things about the Raphael Acts of the Apostles was that the borders had two different levels of narrative. The side borders represented mythological and allegorical figures, which provided a commentary on the central scenes. And then at the bottom, there was this faux bronze relief. Some of the scenes showed scenes from the lives of the apostles, and some of the scenes showed scenes from the life of Pope Leo X. So it set an example that later on was to be emulated and to stimulate great variety in Brussels tapestry design. And then your second question, yes, tragically, in some cases, tapestries in the late 18th century, when people just didn't understand what they were doing, they were used as carpets, and of course, the fine silk, the gold thread, just disintegrates. Every so often, you see a piece in a coming up at auction where it's so clear that you can practically see where it was by a door, and it's all worn away.
Thank you. How do you transport, mount, and hang a 500-year-old tapestry?
Good question. In the past, they were carefully looked after. They would have been put in sort of canvas bags, but these big tapestries, they only weigh about, my colleague Beth in Textile Conservation said, each tapestry only weighs about 100 pounds. So they're relatively portable, but because they're so fragile, of course, today they're wound on large cylinders, which are then set within enormous crates, and that weigh a ton. And when they arrive, we have to take them out. We have to unroll them, plastic sheeting. We position them. They used to be hung up by hooks and eyelets. Today we use Velcro. Velcro is, all the tapestries are lined with light lining to protect them. And we attach Velcro to the top of the tapestries, and that is attached to the beam from which they hang. And we have this wonderful technical team who have this winch system, so they attach 2 or 3 points to carefully hoist up these tapestries into position. And it's a business because they're so fragile. But behind the scenes, we're lucky to have this great crew who have brought this immaculate show to life. Who's got the mic? Up at the back.
Thank you so much for the lecture. Do we have any knowledge about where or how the fibers themselves were sourced? And my other question is, are there master craftsmen at this level working today anywhere?
The materials were very expensive. We know that the cost of tapestries varied in a ratio of 1 to 4 to 20. A tapestry woven just in wool, 1. A tapestry woven with silk and wool, 4. A tapestry including gold, 20. The wool, much of it was made from England. Huge trade back and forth across the English Channel. The silk from Italy, from Spain, and the gold thread also made in various places. One of the remarkable things about tapestries, the 1520s, 1530s, and 1540s, is there is so much gold in the tapestries made for Charles, Francis, and Henry VIII. And I have to believe that some of that gold was being brought back from the New World, being melted down from the gold that the European explorers were plundering. Maria, who's got the?
I'm good. I think you can hear me. I find it interesting. The king's leg to me looks like it would be. He's turning sideways, but his leg is like in the wrong direction.
I think the point is that he's in a very awkward position, literally and metaphorically. The horse is about to collapse on top of him. It's only this chap at the butt holding the tail. It's very humiliating this is the French king, who is a god. He is treated at court, as they all were, as if he was a god. And here he is being manhandled, politely, but being manhandled by Burgundian noblemen. Okay, I think I'm beginning the time signal. Thank you all very much. Do go enjoy the exhibition.